Welcome to the Food Junkies Podcast. Here, we aim to bring you the experience, strength, and hope of professionals working on the front lines in the field of food addiction. Our mission is to educate you, the listener, and increase overall awareness about food addiction as a recognized disorder. Here, we discuss all things recovery, exploring the many pathways people take towards abstinence in order to achieve a health-forward lifestyle. We hope to inspire you to thrive rather than just survive. So stay positive, make a change for yourself, and share your journey with others. And hopefully the message will spread.
We are told by the ultra-processed food industry that a calorie is just a calorie. But is that really true? Welcome to the Food Junkies Podcast. My name is Dr. Vera Tarman, and I am your co-host today, along with Clarissa Kennedy. Today, we speak with Dr. Filippa Juul, a researcher in the field of nutrition and public health, with a focus on the impact of ultra-processed food on health outcomes. Dr. Filippa Juul earned her bachelor's degree in nutrition and dietetics from the Universidad of Madrid in Spain, a master's degree in public health nutrition at Karolinska Institute in Stockholm, Sweden, and her PhD in epidemiology from New York University School of Global Public Health in New York, USA. She's affiliated with the School of Public Health at State University of New York, downstate. Dr. Juul has contributed to several studies examining the relationship between dietary patterns, particularly ultra-processed foods, and chronic diseases such as obesity, metabolic syndrome, and cardiovascular conditions. Her work often uses the NOVA foods classification system to analyze dietary data and inform public health recommendations. We at Food Junkies are particularly interested in her views on the obesogenic and addictive natures of ultra-processed food. What is it about these foods that is such a problem? And why are we still eating them? Welcome, Dr. Filippa Juul.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Great. Tell us, what got you interested in this subject in the first place?
So I've always been very interested in nutrition and the role that diet plays in health, especially chronic diseases. And while I was studying my undergrad in nutrition and dietetics, and then went on to study my master's, there was a lot of discussion and debate within the nutritional science community about, is it really that we should eat a low-fat diet with higher carb, or should we eat low carb with higher fat and higher protein? And that was the main discussion. And I thought there was something missing about that discussion because we didn't talk at all about the quality of foods, right? So it's not just about macronutrients, it's actually about which form are we consuming these macronutrients in. In 2009, a researcher called Carlos Monteiro at the University of Sao Paulo in Brazil published a NOVA classification, arguing that really the missing piece of the puzzle in the obesity epidemic is that we have not considered that our food supply has undergone a massive shift from having been based on whole foods, so foods that we had to buy in the grocery store and then go home and cook, to these ready-made products, which are usually of very poor quality, made from cheap, poor quality ingredients and additives, and with very little whole quality foods, especially very little fruits, vegetables, legumes, nuts, etc., all the things we know that are good for us. So when I read this article that he wrote, for me, that was just such an aha moment. And I was so excited because I felt like finally somebody is addressing this missing piece of the puzzle. That was just when I was starting my master's degree, but I already became very committed to that was an issue that I wanted to pursue. So then as I worked as a research assistant after graduating, I got an opportunity to actually conduct a study on ultra-processed food intake in Sweden over time. And since then, I was hooked. It was the main topic of my research.
Thank you. We're talking about ultra-processed food. So can you give us a little bit of that history of the NOVA system and how did it come about?
Absolutely. So Carlos Monteiro, he's an epidemiologist and medical doctor in Brazil, and he had worked many decades with the nutritional status of the population in Brazil. And he had seen how Brazil had undergone this epidemiological transition that happens across the board in emerging economies where we have less food insecurity, less nutrient deficiencies, but we have increasing rates of diet-related diseases such as obesity and diabetes. So he was curious about why that was. And one of the one of the observations that he made was that people have replaced part of the traditional diet. And the traditional diet in Brazil is partly high in fat. It's also high in sugar and certain desserts, etc. But people were generally not experiencing any diet-related diseases on this traditional diet. But they had increasingly replaced this traditional diet with highly processed foods, ultra-processed foods. Through supermarkets, many big transnational food producers were making major marketing pushes in Brazil. You may have heard about the floating Nestle supermarket that went up the Amazon River to try to sell highly processed foods to indigenous villages along the Amazon. So this was an observation he made. He also worked with Barry Popkin, who's a professor of public health nutrition, who has written extensively about the nutrition transition and the change in diet that happens as with economic growth and globalization. Carlos Monteiro put these pieces together and really thought that we need to systematically evaluate the role of food processing and this shift from whole foods to highly processed foods and what the potential health consequences of that is.
So please tell us about those actual categories.
Absolutely. So the NOVA classification has 4 categories, and the categories are defined both by the extent of processing that has been applied to products, but also the purpose of processing. And this is a very important distinction of the NOVA classification. So if I start from the beginning with group 1 are minimally processed food or unprocessed foods. Most of the things that we buy in a supermarket have been processed to some extent. So it's not really relevant to talk about processed versus not processed food. That's why he did 4 categories. So unprocessed and minimally processed foods, those are foods that have been subjected to only physical processing methods or very traditional simple processing methods, such as fermentation. So, for instance, a plain yogurt that has just added bacteria, milk with added bacteria that has been fermented, that would be a minimally processed foods. Other examples are obviously fresh fruits and vegetables, fresh or frozen meat, poultry, eggs, fish, basically anything where you're buying it in its intact form. To this category, we also count dried beans, dried grains, pastas that are just made from milled from flour and water. So basically whole foods that have either one or 2 or 3 ingredients. But
pasta would fit in that category, not in category 3.
Depending on the ingredients. Okay. So if it's just made from flour and water, it would be a category 1 food.
Okay.
Because the processing it's been subjected to is just physical processes and traditional processes such as milling of the grains and then making the pasta. So even something like, let me give you an example here. If we think about, for instance, corn, so fresh corn on the cob would be a minimally processed food, but so would polenta, which is dried and milled corn. So that would be a minimally processed food. Then we have the second category, and these are what's called processed culinary ingredients. There are foods or ingredients, I should say, because we don't really eat them as foods, that have been extracted from whole foods or from nature. So this is oil, cold pressed oil, not the very processed oil, but olive oil, coconut oil, cream, butter, maple syrup, sugar, salt, etc. So things that we use to cook with, but they're not usually eaten as a food per se.
And high fructose corn syrup would not fit in that, or could it fit in that?
No, it could not fit in that because it has gone through extensive processing.
Okay, beyond extraction.
Exactly. So just as a hydrogenated oil would not fit in that category either, or a modified starch would not fit in that category. So then we have category number 3, and these are called processed foods. So these are foods that have been processed further. They're based on whole foods, but they've undergone some industrial processing, often together with processed culinary ingredients. But these are food that you could basically do at home. Most people don't. Canned tomatoes, canned fish, artisanal breads that don't include any additives that are of exclusive industrial use. They would be processed foods. So obviously foods have been processed in this way for hundreds of years, right? We made bread for hundreds of years. So these would be processed foods. And then we have category 4, which are ultra processed foods. And these are foods that you could not really recreate in your kitchen, either because you don't have access to the technology or you don't have access to the type of ingredients that are in ultra processed foods. And the kind of hallmarks of ultra processed foods are, in terms of purpose, I should say, because I talked about extent and purpose of processing. These are foods that have been processed with the purpose of creating convenience, so ready to eat or ready to heat, durable, so long shelf life, and cheap, like inexpensive foods that are highly palatable and are meant to replace the other categories, so less processed foods. So if you think about something like a chicken nugget, a frozen chicken nugget, right? It has chicken, but it has also all these inexpensive kind of additives and fillers in it. And it's has a long shelf life. It's very convenient. You just throw it in the microwave or in the oven. And obviously it has a lot of salt and fat, etc. So it's highly palatable. And it replaces that you go and buy a piece of chicken and actually cook a piece of chicken. So that would be an example of an ultra-processed food.
When you're looking at the dangers of ultra-processed foods, you're specifically talking about this category. Like you would not include processed foods in that. Or should you be worried about the third category as well?
No, obviously there is research showing that foods that have been conserved with a lot of salt can lead to stomach cancer. For instance, Cantonese fish, which is eaten in China, has been related to stomach cancer. But here we're talking about a broad food group. So we're not talking about the processed foods. Processed foods have been around way before the obesity epidemic and the epidemics of chronic diseases. And also processed foods are usually, they don't tend to replace everything else in the diet, right? We use them as part of the diet. So if I'm making pasta sauce, I may use canned tomatoes, but I'm using it with other foods. So usually in traditional diets, we use foods from category 1, 2, and 3 to combine into meals and dishes, right? Whereas ultra-processed food today, especially in high-income Western countries, you could live only on ultra-processed food if you chose to do, right? Both in terms of what you buy at home, and if you choose to go to certain kinds of restaurants, that could replace everything else. And in many parts of, for instance, the US where I'm based, we have these food deserts or food swamps, we can also call them, where it's very hard to buy anything that's not ultra processed. So the argument that Carlos Monteiro made is that these foods really become problematic when they become a large part of the diet, when we have dietary patterns that are based on these foods. It's not you have one soda and that's going to kill you, but when these foods tend to take over your dietary patterns and they form the base of your diet, which is actually the case in the US. If we look on average, people eat around 60% of their calories from ultra-processed foods, right? So in many countries, these foods are becoming the major provider of energy and nutrients in the diet. And that's where we run into issues in terms of health outcomes.
So before we get to the health outcomes, let's just finish up with this construct, the Nova construct. How did he get that actually accepted? It's a great idea, but are there other ones? And has there been any pushback?
Oh, there's been plenty of pushback. There's some polarization because for a lot of researchers, for a lot of policymakers, this just intuitively made a lot of sense when this classification came out. And to date, this classification have been used in hundreds of studies, and the results are very consistent. I know we'll get to that later, but they're very consistent results in terms of the linkage to health outcomes, to diet quality, etc. So I think that gives a lot of validity to the classification. Obviously, no classification is perfect. And I've worked extensively with this classification, and there are always some foods where you're like, how do we categorize this food, right? It's not always clear cut, but for most cases, it's very clear cut. That being said, there has been a lot of pushback, both from obviously the food industry, who are not happy at all that we're focusing on processing, because traditionally, there's been a lot of focus on nutrients, and it's very easy for the food industry to modify foods to change the nutrient composition, right? So if the news are that carbohydrates are bad, they make low carb versions of the same food. If we say that fat is bad, they make low fat versions or added fiber, whatever it is. It's easy to manipulate. Whereas if we're thinking about the processing level, which is based on the kind of ingredients we have in these foods, but also on the actual form of the foods themselves, how they're produced, it's very hard for the industry to pivot to make less processed foods. It's not impossible, but it's very hard. They would have to change the type of products that they sell. So there's been a lot of pushback from the food industry. There's also been pushback from within the nutrition community. Many researchers who are very invested in the kind of nutrient perspective of foods, or who thinks that this classification is too simple. It's too simplified. So there has been a lot of pushback. I would say this is by far the most used classification. There are others, including there's a front group for the food industry that have made their own classification.
Oh, really?
Yes. But I've looked into it. The fact is that there they mix categories. So there can be foods that are processed for convenience. And there you can have things like very processed foods, ultra processed food, but also bagged salads. So then trying to link any of those categories to a health outcome obviously doesn't work because they mix foods of very different nature in these categories. But there are other classifications. There are also initiatives now to try to improve NOVA, some which are coming from the food industry, which have not been condoned at all by the group of Carlos Montero's group that are working with the food industry, the NOVA classification. Yes, I think I forget there was the second part of your question.
I was asking about the pushback. A community, nutritional community like the keto community might resist because they're really into the macronutrients. Just have enough protein and enough fat. It's okay if it's a keto bar.
Exactly. Although it's funny because a lot of these diets, different fad diets, have sometimes had success. People, when they start eating them, they feel really good and they lose weight and they feel much better because they actually take away all the processed foods, right? But then eventually they start to find these processed alternatives. So somebody who starts out going keto may start by taking away all the ultra processed, baked products and bread and candy, sugar, ice cream, etc. And they feel great because they're basically just eating whole foods. But then at some point they're like, oh, there's this keto ice cream and there's this keto protein bar, and they start incorporating them, and then they might not feel so good anymore. So that happens with gluten-free diets and keto diets and vegan diets.
In my Facebook group today, somebody said, look, I'm eating the right proportion of proteins and fats and I'm still not losing weight. It might just be the fact that she's eating processed nutrients that is causing the weight stall, correct?
Yeah, absolutely.
So tell us more about what is it about processing itself that can be in and of itself problematic?
Yeah, so there's a lot of research going on trying to figure out the mechanisms. What we do know for sure from actually 2 randomized controlled trials now is that if you give people for 2 weeks or 1 week a diet that is very high in ultra-processed foods, so based on ultra-processed foods, they will eat more. They will eat between 500 and 800 calories more per day than if they get a diet that is made from unprocessed food or minimally processed foods with no ultra-processed foods, with a similar or the same macronutrient composition, right? This has been shown in a US randomized controlled trial and recently also confirmed in a Japanese randomized controlled trial, where even though the intervention diets were matched for macronutrients and non-beverage energy density, the participants ate unconsciously way more calories, 500 to 800 calories per day more. So it's a lot of calories more when they ate the ultra-processed diet compared to the unprocessed diet. And they also tended to gain weight on the ultra-processed diet.
You're saying you don't know what the mechanism is, but one of them is surely they've taken the fiber out.
Yeah, absolutely. So we do have some clues regarding mechanisms. Some are more demonstrated than others. Some are hypothetical. But so one of the most important ones, as you say, is that we take out fiber and water from ultra-processed foods, and we tend to add ingredients that have a lot of calories, such as sugar and fat, etc. These foods are energy dense, which we know that the human body is we're bad at regulating our food intake in terms of calories. We regulate it more with volume, right? So if we have a lot of calories on a small volume, we tend to eat more before we feel full. The other thing is that these foods tend to be soft. They tend to be very easy to eat. Even something like a chip, which is crunchy, right? A potato chip, you eat it fast. There's a lot of calories in each bite, which means that ultra-processed foods have a higher eating intake rate than minimally processed foods. So it means that we eat more calories per minute. And that's something that's been shown to be linked to higher energy intake total and weight gain as well. So we have these 2 qualities combined, that they're energy dense and they have a texture that also make them likely to overeat. And it has an impact on both satiety and satiation. So that means that we're likely to eat more of them before we feel full, and then they don't keep us full as long either. And that may be due to the fact that they are more rapidly absorbed in the bloodstream because they're basically pre-digested nutrients, right? We don't have to break down any fibrous cell walls to get to the nutrient. That can lead to blood sugar spikes, and that then dips and triggers hunger. It can also lead to the fact that the nutrients are absorbed earlier in the digestive tract, can impact the excretion of appetite regulating hormones further down in the intestine, because there's not a lot of nutrients left further down in the intestine, where usually this satiety response is triggered and we release these hormones that help us control.
The specific example, and maybe if you can explain the same thing again. So pizza that you make, that Italian grandmother makes, it would be in category 3, probably. But frozen pizza is decidedly in category 4. But why would pizza in category 3 be not as bad as 4? Because it's...
Yeah, absolutely. So I haven't finished with the mechanism. Okay. A lot of the mechanisms also have to do with additives, things like that. So the pizza dough would be very different that the Italian grandma uses. The flour may be different, but also the types of additives that are in there, the types of additives that are in the cheese, the general composition. Yeah. And it's not just about one food. It's also about the totality of the diet. How does a diet made from ultra-processed food look like versus another diet, right? But if you think about something like the chicken McNugget versus a piece of chicken, that will be very different, because the piece of chicken, you will have to chew it much more. It's harder, right? So you will have to chew it more. That will make it more satiating, and it's very high in protein, doesn't have a lot of carbohydrates, and it will just be more satiating because it takes longer time to eat if we're comparing. Versus chicken McNuggets, you will eat way more calories in the same amount of time that it takes you to eat the chicken piece. And then it also have more refined carbohydrates that may spike your blood sugar more. So that's just one food. But if we're talking about something like a protein bar, which has fat and sugar, etc., but there are no kind of whole cells in it, versus almonds. So almonds, first of all, they take longer to chew, but then your body actually, even though you chew it, many cells are intact when it reaches your digestive tract. And those cell walls actually have to be broken down along the digestive tract for you to extract the nutrients. And about 25% of the calories in those almonds are just going to pass right through you, because you're actually not going to rupture all the cells. You're not going to extract all the calories.
And I know that when I give my dog cashews, half of them are in her poop.
Yeah, exactly. It's the same with us. So if you think about something like a protein bar, which you may match it for calories, it's made up out of isolated protein, isolated starches, isolated fat that's put together. So you will absorb all of that straight away. So it means that even though you think both of them, these portions are 100 calories, it's 75 calories versus 100 calories. And the almonds will satiate you more, and they will not spike your blood sugar in the same way. So there are all these additive effects. Then there is emerging evidence also showing that several additives in ultra-processed foods can contribute to inflammation, can contribute to dysbiosis of the gut microbiome, and also to poor glycemic control, especially artificial sweeteners. But I do want to say another thing about, in terms of that these foods are likely to make you overeat, because there's this concept of hyperpalatability. And hyperpalatability,
we call it addiction.
Yeah, exactly. So the definition that's been used in research are that there are these nutrient pairs. So it's fats and, let me see if I get this right, fats and sugar, carbs and salt, and fat and salt. Those are the 3 nutrient pairs. And obviously these pairs are very rare in nature. We don't have them usually in the same food. We have fruits, dates, very high in sugar, but they don't have any fat. Or we have nuts and avocados, which are high in fat, but they don't have any sugar. And neither of them have any salt. So in nature, these nutrient combinations are very rare. When we put them together, it triggers a higher food reward. We get a bigger kind of satisfaction and kick out of these foods. And it's been shown that when these nutrient pairs cross certain thresholds, so you could have a homemade cookie or industry-made cookie, or another industry-made cookie, and depending on the exact level of these nutrient pairs, so say it's fat and sugar in that cookie, the one that crosses the hyperpalatability threshold will be way more rewarding for you to eat. And it will be much harder to stop eating it, even though I may give you these two cookies. One is hyperpalatable, one is not. And you will say they taste equally good. But one you keep eating, right? So it's been shown that 75% of ultra-processed foods in the US food supply are hyperpalatable. They cross these threshold. What more is that a lot of tobacco companies, when we got stricter regulation on tobacco, actually shifted to the food industry. And the companies that are partly funded by the tobacco industry, they're actually more likely to have these hyperpalatable combinations.
Right. And these hyperpalatable combinations are triggering the dopamine spikes in the same way as they are the insulin spikes.
Yes, exactly. They actually impact our food reward as well. So to take it all back, like they're less satiating, they're more hyperglycemic, you're more likely to overeat them because they contain more energy per gram, and you're more likely to keep eating them because they trigger these reward processes.
So those are some mechanisms to explain why ultra-processed food is more problematic.
Absolutely. I would say those mechanisms explain why we tend to overeat these foods and not being able to stop eat them, or we crave them. Then there are other potential issues with the kind of additives that they include that may trigger inflammation or gut dysbiosis, or some additives may be carcinogenic as well.
So why don't you tell us about your study, the ultra-processed food, a scoping review for Nordic nutrition recommendations?
Yeah, that was a review I did for the Nordic nutrition recommendations, which are the dietary guidelines for the Nordic countries, to really try to understand what is the evidence we have that link these foods to chronic diseases or other diseases of interest. And then we also wrote a section of what are the potential underlying mechanism. But basically, there have been over 100 prospective cohort studies done on ultra-processed foods and various health outcomes. And we see quite consistently that higher consumption of these foods are linked to higher risk of overall mortality, so all-cause mortality, cardiovascular disease mortality, cardiovascular disease incidence, type 2 diabetes, obesity, and especially those are the outcomes that are most studies, but there are also links to poor mental health, so depression and anxiety. There are some studies on cancer and some studies on other metabolic outcomes such as hypertension and metabolic syndrome.
And when we've spoken to other people, it seems that the main mechanism that explains all of those consequences is inflammation.
That is a strong hypothesis. There was actually a really well-made study in an Italian prospective cohort where they compared the association between ultra-processed foods and mortality with the association between what's called Nutri-Score. So that's a measure of nutrient composition that's used in Europe to signal if a food is healthy or not, with mortality. And what they saw was that both ultra-processed food intake and a poorer diet quality determined by Nutri-Score was associated with increased risk of mortality. But the association across different causes of mortality was much more consistent for ultra-processed food intake. Then they did a joint analysis of these two, which meant that they were asking the question, is the association between ultra-processed food and mortality confounded by diet quality? Basically, are we just seeing an association between ultra-processed food and mortality because ultra-processed food tend to have a poor diet quality, tend to have poor nutrient profiles, right?
Yeah.
And what they saw, that was not the case. But when they did the reverse, they saw that actually the association between the Nutri-Score, the diet quality, and mortality could be explained by differences in ultra-processed food to a certain part. And they did further analysis of mediation, looking at different biomarkers of inflammation, et cetera. And they saw that inflammation explained quite large proportion of the association between ultra-processed foods and mortality. Kidney function also explained part of this association. So there seems to be specific pathways that, because obviously chronic diseases are multifactorial, meaning that there are many different causes of them, even though nutrient quality of a diet may be associated with higher mortality. It seems that there are different pathways through which that affects nutrient mortality versus ultra-processed foods.
Could genetics be part of that pathway? Some people just can't tolerate and other people can eat anything?
And it's possible that there's individual responses. So for instance, in terms of how ultra-processed food trigger our food reward, there was a recent study that looked at the dopamine response to an ultra-processed milkshake. And not everybody had a huge dopamine response to this milkshake, but some people did. And what they saw was that the people who had a big response to them actually several days later, they did a buffet lunch and people could eat as much as they wanted. And the people who had a higher response to the milkshake ate more ultra-processed cookies at this lunch.
Can I just interject for 1 second? Because when we're looking at ultra-processed food addiction, we see it's about 14 to 20% of the population. So could that be the subset that showed the higher dopamine response and then continued the behavior is because they were genetically predisposed to it already coming into the study?
Absolutely. Absolutely. That is very possible.
Okay. You talked about those pairings. Could sugar be the main driver of this hyperpalatability? So that if we remove that, like, how do we know that it's not sugar that's in the processed food? Because it's embedded in everything, isn't the actual culprit. And if we remove that, a lot of this would collapse.
Obviously, sugar is a huge part of ultra-processed foods, but it's not the only part. And we have several that's happening across the board now that sugars are being replaced with non-nutritive sweeteners, which also have very dubious health effects. The science is still emerging on this, but we're starting to see that actually, we see an observational study that people eat artificial sweeteners actually have an increased risk of diabetes and of obesity and all-cause mortality across their lifetime. It's similar to sugar that it increases your risk for diabetes. And then we're also seeing in the experimental studies that these non-nutritive sweeteners, they're not metabolically inert. We used to think that they just went through us and they had no impact, but they do seem to have an effect on our glucose metabolism, on lipid metabolism, and also on our gut microbiome in ways that make the gut microbiome more inflammatory and also make us have a worse glycemic control. So it's not just like we remove sugar, we put in non-nutritive sweeteners and everything is fine. So sugar is also just one of these nutrient pairings, right? So carbohydrate and salt is another one, for instance. So I agree with you that sugar is a huge part of the problem. And obviously, if we removed sugar from all of these foods, a lot of them wouldn't taste good. So nobody would eat them, but it's not the only issue with ultra-processed.
That would be the difference between somebody who wants to eat a cookie and another person that wants to eat potato chips. They're, as you described before, both of them are problematic, right? Okay.
Absolutely.
Okay, what do we do about this situation? We're not going to be able to stop the processed food industry. So should we work with it and try to reintroduce some of the things that have been changed to make it healthier, introduce fiber, as it were? Like, what's the next step in terms of what do we do now?
Yeah, absolutely. It's tricky, especially in countries like the US, the UK, where a lot of the diet is based on ultra-processed food. It's so ingrained in our food supply. It's easier for emerging economies, such as several Latin American countries, that have put really strict regulations on marketing and sales of ultra-processed foods, which I think is the right approach because they still have the chance to stop this change in diets that is happening. In the US, it's harder, but I think we do need stricter regulation. First of all, we need stricter regulation on marketing of these foods, especially to children. And I think that's something that's more politically palatable, right? We all want to protect our children. So I think that is number one. Number two is I think we need much stricter regulation of what goes into our food. We have very little oversight here. We have 4,000 additives in our food, many of which are not allowed in food in Europe. So it's not just about taking the chemicals out of these foods, because obviously the foods would still be poor quality. But if we do have a stricter regulation on the chemicals, the food industry would not be able to produce all of these foods that they are producing, right? It wouldn't be as lucrative for them.
And all we have right now is grass, generally recognized as safe. Give us your opinion about that.
It's useless because the food industry, they can add in any additive they want and just say, we consider this to be generally recognized as safe.
And
Notice by the FDA, right? That's it. Even trans fats were generally recognized as safe. And even once we knew that the first reports came that these are really bad for us, it took 30 years to ban them and remove them from the food supply. But we do need stricter regulation. I think there's a top and a bottom approach. So hopefully, as there's growing awareness about this issue, people start to demand better foods. But there also needs to be stricter regulation because that creates a level playing field for the industry where everybody's forced to innovate and come up with better products, so products that are of lower processing level. Because you can create convenient foods that are not ultra processed. It's possible to make crackers out of good ingredients that are not ultra processed. They exist on the market now. It's just they're out of reach for a lot of people because they're more expensive. It's possible to have everything that's frozen vegetables, super convenient, not ultra processed. I think in countries like the US, there needs to be a cultural shift as well, because these foods are it's hard. But I think the issue is not so much the Halloween candy. The issue is that everything that goes in even the kids' lunch boxes is ultra processed. Like even you think that you're giving them something healthy, but you have a sandwich of ultra processed bread with ultra processed cheese or meat product, and you give them something that seems healthy, like these vegetable straws that are like, it's all snack food. It's all pre-prepared food. And that's what kids eat day in and day out. And that's the issue. If you would have a whole foods based diet, the Halloween candy is not an issue. It's not great for you, but it's one time a year and it's candy and it's a treat. But right now for children, it's 67% of energy from ultra processed foods. So it really is the majority of their diet.
So do you have any hope for change in the direction of nutrition science and how we're evolving and understanding this?
I do have hope. I think the fact that this actually has become such a big topic, despite the industry's best efforts to discredit the science and put a lid on it, quiet it down, I do think there will be change. I hope so. And there's a lot of people who are working on this. There's a lot of more awareness in the public. I think it's a start. The fact that several states have started to ban these food colors and certain additives in food, I think that's a step in the right direction. I would say that the obesity crisis is one of the biggest crises for public health. It's an affordability crisis. It already has huge financial implication. It will continue to have huge financial implications. And obviously at an individual level, it causes a lot of suffering as well. So we really need to improve the food supply and the food system. We need to make nutritious whole foods available and accessible and affordable to everyone. And we need to serve these kind of food in schools as well. And in schools, we need to teach children how to cook because we cannot assume that they're getting taught that at home. We also need stricter regulations on marketing and production of ultra-processed foods. So we need way more oversight of the foods that are sold and marketed.
We need more research. Do you feel, because you're right in the field right now, that there is a growing interest and that there will be a tipping point where the food industry just simply can't say no anymore? Just like it happened with tobacco. Eventually, the research just overwhelmed their resistance.
I think that is exactly what's going to happen. I think that's what's going to happen. Right now, the opposition is clinging on to, we don't know every mechanism and we don't 100% know. And there are so many randomized controlled trials actually going on this topic that I think there will be a tipping point. Also, in my opinion, obviously, we do have enough evidence that we should avoid these foods or limit the consumption just based on the research we have. We don't need to understand every mechanism in order to do that. But I do think once we have a few of these more studies, I think there will be a tipping point. And it's funny, everything is playing out just like tobacco as well.
What would you say to the family who is struggling in one of these food swamps in the States? What can we do now for folks?
It is extremely hard. If you're somewhere where you don't have access to fresh food, it is extremely hard. I feel for those families because the affordability and access to fresh foods is extremely hard. I would say, though, that first of all, take it back to basics. And also, it doesn't have to be fresh. Like frozen vegetables are great. Canned beans are great, or dried beans. Just learn how to cook a few simple recipes with whatever you can find that is affordable and available to you will make a difference. Obviously, cut out sodas, the first thing, because that's just the most low-hanging fruit. And then start reading labels, because we can always choose between products to try to choose the better product. And then in many communities, there are resources like food pantries or availability to maybe have farm share, etc. It will be different for different communities, but really try to find the local resources or an organization that can connect you to local resources. Organizations like Feeding America or other anti-hunger organizations can connect you to the resources.
Okay. Is there a way that we can work with the food industry, given that the tipping point is coming and they themselves realize that they may have to shift? How should we even think about that?
It's a very tricky question. I have to say, it's very hard. I think it's important that the food industry do not interfere with the policy process or with the research. We have to understand that even despite whatever they pledge, they are in the business of making money. And we have to understand that, right? It's not that they're evil, but they're in the business of making money. So I think absolutely we can have conversations with them, but they should not be allowed to dictate policy. We dictate the policy, and then it's their job to innovate in order to find ways to make money. So we should think about policy that actually incentivize them to produce healthy foods, to be a part of the solution. But I don't think we can just think that they will do that out of the goodness of their heart. We have to make it attractive for them to do that. And then we should not settle with them saying we're going to self-regulate, because that will never be the answer.
If you can say, look, I'm one of the researchers and I know that ultra-processed food mechanisms are, for example, the pre-digested quality, put in some of the digestibles back. If we actually give them back some information, could that be a solution?
Absolutely, absolutely. But I think that goes back to regulating, for instance, regulating what can be sold in schools, regulating what can be marketed, etc. So put some parameters around that. And that's actually, it's been very successful in the UK. I think it was in London, where they put very strict regulations of what kind of foods that could be marketed. It was obviously based on nutrients, but it really shifted to much better foods being marketed, because they didn't take away the opportunity for the food industry to market their foods, because they realized this they need to be able to do that. But by putting very strict regulations in terms of the nutrient composition of these foods, they could not market these highly ultra-processed foods anymore because they just didn't fit the bill. So I think that the food industry is very innovative. So if we put parameters, they will find a way to produce, and then it can be a win-win. It's not that they should be able to make money, and we need them. We need food, but it has been a little bit of the Wild West, especially in the US.
What about the GLP-1s? Are they going to change the landscape of ultra-processed food at all?
They may. Actually read a very interesting article about that there's intense research going on in the food industry now to try to create these products that will appeal to people on GLP-1, right? Because it actually, GLP-1 changes people's taste preferences. So all of a sudden they think that the junk food and fast food tastes horrible. It's too sweet. It's too salt. It's too greasy.
Yes, it is.
It is, exactly. It's like they're finally tasting the true flavor. Yeah. And they crave vegetables and fruit and lemon and all these fresh things. So the food industries are trying to create products that will appeal to those flavors, like things that are high protein and have fresh flavors. I would be very, very wary of that, because these foods, they're trying to sell foods. And if people they're craving apples and cherries, we could just let them eat apples and cherries or sell apples and cherries. But they're trying to create all these convenience foods, right?
Foods that make apples taste more appley.
Yeah, exactly. No, but so I think it is going to change. I think the food industry are very scared of these GLP-1 because people are buying less food. They are consuming less foods. I think they're worried about that.
Okay. In closing, we're very interested in food addiction and have adopted a consensus that we should call it ultra-processed food addiction as opposed to just sugar addiction. Would you be in agreement with that? What are your comments about that nomenclature?
I think that would make a lot of sense. I think that is the kind of foods that people tend to get addicted to, are especially ultra-processed foods. And they're also the ones that are readily available for people. Before, if you craved a cake 100 years ago, you had to make it yourself, or you had to buy it at a bakery and it was very expensive, right? Yeah. Now you walk into a drugstore and you can buy anything. So
yeah, that makes so much sense to me, because working frontline with people with ultra-processed food use disorder is what we hope it will be called. My clients in the minute are not like baking cookies. They're going to the store and buying cookies. And so to me, that's like exactly.
We won't wait for the baking. We just eat the raw.
Right. There's no time to bake and wait. So they would probably eat the cookie dough versus actually waiting. So I think that's where, when we were looking at it, sugar addiction just didn't necessarily fit in the same way that ultra processed food use disorder did. So I'm curious, what's next for you?
Yeah, I'm looking at ways to narrow down on the mechanisms as well.
Right. Good.
Yeah, I think that's the next step. And also trying to understand different policy options in order to reduce consumption and what the implications of those policies would be in order to actually have data. Because a lot of the time now it's just, oh no, it's not possible. We can't do this. It's going to have adverse effect, etc. So I think we need to actually look at that, and we can do that through simulation studies, simulating the effect of different policies.
That's so exciting. I have loved this whole interview so far. We have one signature question, and I'm wondering if you could answer. If you could tell a younger version of yourself something about ultra-processed foods, what would it be?
It's not about the calories or about the nutrients. I have to admit, when I was in high school, I drank Diet Coke every day. And I thought that was completely fine because it doesn't have any calories. And now I realize that, no, that is not something that provide any nourishment. So the other advice I would actually say to my younger self is to think about nourishment. I think that's what we really have to think about. That's the key. And I think a lot of the potential health effects of ultra-processed food is actually just the fact that we're not eating whole foods. We're not eating nourishing foods. These foods have negative effects on their own, the ultra-processed foods, but they also replace the foods that we actually need, that nourish us. And eating ultra-processed food also replaces the habit of cooking a meal, of sharing a meal with people. It's more like you rip a paper out of something and eat it, right? So that's something that nourishes our soul. So I think the two goes together. So I would say nourishment should be the key word in terms of living a healthy and happy life.
And for us, nourishment means satiety as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, nourishment is not about deprivation at all. Nourishment is about eating a meal that satisfies you both physically and mentally and socially. And I think that's something that's so inherent to human nature. And we're losing it a little bit in the modern society when we're eating something alone in our car.
Yeah. It's like we need to rebuild that loving relationship with food that we've lost.
Thank you so much, Filippa, for spending this time with us.
Thank you. It was wonderful. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for joining us this week on Food Junkies Recovery from Food Addiction. Make sure to join our Facebook group, Sugar Free for Life Support Group. I'm Sweet Enough. Molly and Clarissa are food addiction professionals who offer one-to-one counseling and group coaching through Sweet Sobriety. Please subscribe to our show so you never miss an episode. While you're at it, if you found value in today's episode, we'd appreciate you leaving us a review on your favorite platform. Your feedback helps grow our show and allows us to reach others who need to hear this message of recovery. Don't forget to pick up a copy of Dr. Tarman's book, Food Junkies. And as Vera always says, the power is ours.